So we're on lesson number 5 in our book, and kind of roughly following that, the lesson outline, kind of, sort of. It has all the material, really, a lot of the material that I want us to kind of cover, but we're not following the book per se. If you've read the first 2 or 3 pages in lesson 5, or 3 or 4 pages, then you've kind of read what we're going to be talking about today. And then this week, read the rest of the chapter, the rest of that lesson. And it'll kind of put some things in mind that we'll be talking about, in this class period. But really glad you're here this morning. Let's start with a word of prayer here this morning. Anthony, would you lead us?
Heavenly Father, thank you for this day that we have to fellowship with each other, get together with other Christians, and worship you and study more in your word. Help us to focus and apply what we learn to our lives. And be with us as we study your word. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. So sometimes when people look at the Bible, maybe you're sitting down with some friends and you start talking about the Bible, they might have some questions about Old Testament, New Testament, like, what's the difference? And if they've read the Bible enough, they realize, well, there are some differences in the Old Testament and New Testament. So now the question becomes, why is that? I mean, if the Bible is all from God, words from God, why does the Old Testament read different than the New Testament? And why does the Old Testament talk about things that the New Testament does not? And why was there a law given to these people that seems to be different than the law given to these people? And those become all very real questions we have to deal with. What I find out a lot of times is people who are already New Testament Christians really don't understand the difference between the Testaments, and it's still confusing. I don't know that it really has to be confusing, but I think sometimes, like a lot of things, we have to kind of step back from it some and try to understand the bigger picture of some things. Because there is a bigger picture here. In fact, if I were to ask you, what is the big picture of the Bible? What would you say? How would you describe that or define that? And there may be some different ways we approach that. But what would you say? Okay, so what is the purpose of the Bible? What's the big picture of the Bible?
To present the truth.
Okay, to present the truth. Whose truth? God's truth. Because look, I mean, we live in a time where in many Bible discussions, it's, that's your truth. My truth is this. And so now we have to define truth. If we say, well, the Bible presents truth, we have to define that now. Because people look at truth differently. Okay, go with that some more. Okay, so how would you describe the Bible? Big picture. What is this?
What are we doing here?
Okay, yeah, it answers the question. Why are we here?
God's plan for man.
God's plan for man. Okay, what else would we see? Knowledge. What kind of knowledge? Knowledge of what? Different ways we might go with that. We say,
Just the world as a whole, our souls.
Okay, all right, we get a picture of the world, God's view. Well, we also have man's view there too, we would see. We learn something about our souls. Well, we learn that we have a soul. So look, all of these are reasonable things that we're learning when we say, like, what is the Bible and what does it mean? And somewhere along the line, someone said, well, we learn about salvation. And I wonder even if that's the big picture. So if we learn about salvation, where do we learn about salvation in the Bible? How would you answer that?
Through Christ.
Through Christ. Go more. Where do we learn about salvation in the Bible?
I would say there's multiple. Salvation shows itself in different ways in the Bible.
Okay. So I expected someone was going to say, you did good on this, okay? I expected someone was going to say, well, the New Testament teaches us about salvation. That's not an incorrect statement.
But everything in the Old Testament leads us up to
Yes.
We start to see that pattern from the very beginning.
We learn about salvation from the very beginning of Genesis. First, we learn how salvation is lost, or a relationship with God is lost with Adam and Eve. But then we start learning about God's plan in chapter 3. We start learning there about God's plan to save mankind. So, big picture, we look at the Bible and we may very well say, I think we can say and should say, it describes for us God's plan for man. That it's one story. And sometimes people, they kind of struggle, not even one story, man. There's like hundreds of people, there's thousands of chapters. It's like, what do you mean one story? No, I really believe it is one story from Genesis to the Revelation. It's God's redemption of man. Now, it's portrayed through a lot of different little stories, and there are hundreds of characters that are introduced in the story. But we can see how the Old Testament connects to the New Testament, or maybe we say it the other way around. But we see that it's one story, God's redemption of man. That's what it's about. On Wednesday night, Todd covered some information that I thought was helpful, just kind of a review of when you're flipping through the Bible, how the Bible is broke down, or how we can break it down in different segments of, books of history or in books of poetry or wisdom, and, it's broke down in different ways. The prophets, major and minor. And it's interesting, I think, for us is to understand how God has spoke to us in many different ways. The message, though, is the same all the way through. There are two divisions in the Bible, or a division that makes two parts of the Bible. Perhaps that's the better way of saying that. And most everybody knows there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. But why? And it's something that I find often has to be explained, because when you're sitting down with someone who has not studied the Bible at all, it becomes a very real question. Why is it divided into two pieces? And here again, I'm kind of interested. How would you explain that? What would you say?
I think we've got to have some contrast between the first covenant that God attempted with his people, that it just didn't work. It didn't work for man. So we've got to have a contrast between the old and the new to understand the big picture.
Okay. All right.
I almost think of as a book like a prequel and a sequel. You know what I mean?
Okay.
You have the prequel, which is like a build up and it lays the foundation
Okay.
for everything.
Right.
And then you have the active or the sequel that actually expands on that.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Good.
This may not bode well with someone who doesn't know the Bible too well, but in the simplest sense, it's just the way that God intended it.
Okay.
It's how
Right.
he wanted it to happen. The Old Testament shows a lot more of his power and
All right.
over his people, and then the New Testament shows a lot more about his son and his sacrifice in the beginning of the early church. So they show two very different things, but in the way it was just how God wanted it to happen.
Okay, good. It shows different things, but it all shows the same thing.
Yeah.
Doesn't that sound kind of weird? But I kind of think it is that way. It's different things said to different people in a different time, and yet its purpose or theme is all the same, Old Testament and New Testament. It's about God saving man. That part is the same. That doesn't change. So, two testaments, two covenants. Why? Why are there two?
I think we tend to look at it in New Testament and Old Testament, but obviously that's kind of a organizing thing that we've done to help us distinguish it. But really, it's just before Christ and after Christ.
Okay.
So I think in my mind that helps me distinguish it as Christ's life.
Okay, I see what you're saying. We kind of see the division between the old and new as a time when there's this introduction to Christ. Well, He's introduced in the Old Testament, but we see him in life in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were introduced to him in that so very real way when he's living in the flesh. But still, this idea of testament, and Todd kind of dealt with this some on Wednesday. We got to think this thing through some more. Testament, just what does that mean? And what power goes along with a covenant or a testament? Like, what does that mean? What is the significance of a covenant or a testament? Sandra and I had redid our will recently, a couple years ago, recently. And it hadn't been done since we had guardians for the kids. We were a little behind on getting that updated, all right? And so we needed to go through and do that. It's kind of one of those weird things when you start reading it, the last will and testament of Joe Greer. Things start sounding very real all of a sudden. And you know how a will works. How you want some things handled when you are no more, when you die. And it's all put together in all these pages and everything like that. And it's like, just what value is that testament or that will today? How much value is there in that?
Doesn't do much now.
Doesn't do anything now. It's not worth anything now. Anybody who's named or listed in there's nothing. They have nothing from me until I die. And even then, they don't get much. But it's it just but it's not worth anything until the testator dies, right? But you see, we understand how that works, and we also understand that a will doesn't have any effect until a testator dies. And so we kind of understand those principles, right? So what does that have to do with our lesson? Well, I kind of think it has a lot. Because look, we have to understand, and I think we need to be able to explain to people the difference between this old covenant and a new covenant. I think we could even make another division here. It's not another testament, but just if we're thinking about periods of time in the Bible, okay? Because, Todd explained the other night, this Old Testament we have here was written over a period of 1,100 years or so. Then between the Old Testament and New Testament, 400 years of silence, remember? And then the New Testament was all written in about 100 years. 1,500 years, period of time, the writing of this. 40 different writers, is what we have. But if we were to divide time a little bit, I think this is an accurate way of doing this. I actually see three very distinct periods of time in the Bible story. First we have Genesis and halfway through Exodus, a period of time where God spoke directly to people. See, there was no written law at that time. That didn't come until we get here to Exodus chapter 20. Now there was a written law. And so to be able to understand these divisions, I don't know, is helpful for me, and I have found it at times very helpful when trying to talk. And why do these things never work right for me? Now, if Ben was clicking on this thing, it would just go. You put me in front of people, and the more often something's not going to work right. I don't know. Different periods of time that we see in Scripture. Patriarchal age. We read Genesis up through chapter 19 of Exodus. It was a period of time when God spoke directly to the patriarchs. There was nothing written for Adam and Eve. There was nothing written down, for in conversation with Noah or with Abraham. And we start thinking of those like Abraham as being the beginning of the patriarchs. when God's seed was promised through Abraham. But we see there was an unwritten law. Was there a law? Yes, absolutely. God told the patriarchs, here's what I want you to do. Here's what happens if you don't obey. This was an unwritten, it spoke directly to the patriarchs all through this period of time. And then we come to, we get to chapter 20 of Exodus, and using these kind of archaic terms, Mosaic age. I don't know what else to call it. The days when Moses lived. It's kind of like saying the Mosaic age. As old as that sounds, the patriarchal age. Just sounds so different and old to me. But something different happened. In chapter 19 of Exodus, when the children of Israel were surrounding Mount Sinai, God called Moses to the top. He gives instructions to them. He says, go tell the people, if you obey my will, you obey my statute, you obey my law, I will be your God and you will be my people. Moses went back and told the people all that, and they said, yeah, we'll do that. And God came down on the mountain before them 3 days later. It was right after that God delivered to Moses the 10 Commandments. There's a written law now. And that's a law that's delivered to the Jews. I think we have to just make some point of emphasis on these things. Different period of time, something different, something has changed here. Moses is the deliverer of the law. It was not Moses' law. We know that, right? Sometimes I think that slips a little bit. And sometimes the Bible refers to it as the law of Moses. Moses didn't make the law. He was just the deliverer of that law, right? So, different period of time, we see here. And then, finally, this Christian age, we might call it, begins at the cross. A written law, again, given to all men. I just want us to see and make some distinction here on periods of time. Patriarchal age, God spoke directly to the patriarchs, gave them instruction. Mosaic age, there's a written law, 10 Commandments, and 613 other laws that are written down to the Jews, delivered to the Jews. The audience is the Jews, receivers of the law. The law is nailed to the cross. Christian age. Jesus delivers a law to all men. I want us to spend some time talking about these things, because I think we have to be able to understand very well how this works, how it all fits and flows together. That this is, in fact, one story, one Bible story, Genesis to the Revelation. It is one Bible story. And I hope we can see that. All right, so I've been spewing on here for a few minutes. Thoughts or questions, comments?
It's a good way to explain to new Christians or people who are questioning, in the Old Testament they did sacrifices and things like that.
Uh-huh.
If you're supposed
Yeah.
to follow the Bible, why don't we do that?
Yeah, why don't we do that?
It's a way to say why.
Exactly. And people think, well, those questions never come up. Oh yeah, they do. And there's some very good explanations for this. It's not hard. And the other things too, when you sit down with someone and they say, well, your church, they say. I never liked this term, your church, my come to my church. I don't have a church. The Lord does. I'm a part of that, but it's His church. I know what people mean when we say that. I understand. I know what we mean. I just can't get comfortable saying that. It's the Lord's church. But people say, your church doesn't have music. And they're talking about instrumental music. And you start talking about where are they going to go to make some explanation or proof why they would use instrumental music in worship. Where are they going to go? Old Testament. They're going to turn to the pages of the Old Testament. And so if there's not an understanding about this covenant and this covenant, we will never be able to discuss that issue and draw any biblical conclusions. We have to understand the differences in the testaments. So that's just a couple examples there.
So, in the case where the pendulum swings so far, where you'll hear people say, like, the Old Testament is unnecessary, or
Mhm.
you shouldn't even really be looking at that, what would you say is a good way of approaching that? Because obviously,
Okay.
that's the other extreme.
It is. Okay, we will. Good question. I'm going to defer because I want us to work up to that. But I think ultimately that is the question that has to be answered right there. So why is there even an Old Testament? Why isn't it in our Bible? Or like I used to hear some Christians say, I don't hear this much anymore. I haven't heard it in a long time, in fact. They just have just a New Testament. This is all we need is the New Testament. We are just New Testament Christians. I've heard brethren say that. You know, I remember years ago, early preaching, someone saying, this is about 100 years ago, someone saying, like, man, you preach from the Old Testament too much. We're just New Testament Christians. You should just preach from the New Testament. Really? I mean, just think that through. Well, don't answer that. We'll get to that. But it's like, really? We should be able to answer that. I think we should be able to think better than what that statement was saying. Okay, so the patriarchal age. We read about Abraham, about Moses, God speaking directly to them. We get that. We see how that works. There was not a written law. God spoke directly to the patriarchs. We come to this Mosaic age. There's a written law now. And it is delivered to the Jews. We just referenced a moment ago Exodus chapter 19 when God spoke to Moses, tell them if they obey my will and keep my statutes, I'll be their God, they shall be my people. Okay? Exodus, chapter 19. Let's look at some passages. I want us to get this, I want to put this all in some perspective, all right? Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 1. Chapter 5, verse 1. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 1. Moses summoned all Israel and said, Hear, O Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today. Learn them and be sure to follow them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. It was not with our fathers that He made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive here today. Who was the covenant made with?
People of Israel.
Children of Israel. That's who the covenant was made with. That's who this covenant was for. I don't know. Seems like a minor point, but I think we have to make that connection. Verse 31 kind of repeats the same things. I know and understand all the commands and laws that I give you this day, God says to the children of Israel. So when we read throughout these pages here, all the way up to the New Testament, we are reading the days of the children of Israel and the living under the law that God gave them. Now, let me say something else. We make this hard distinction where the New Testament begins. What about those living that we read about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? What law were they living under?
They still very much follow the old law,
Why were they following the old law?
because that's what had been.
There wasn't a new law. That's what was. That's what was in effect. Someone said recently, Jesus was the only real Christian there's ever been. It was an interesting discussion. And had to kind of work that one around a little bit. Was Jesus a good Christian? What do you think?
A number of things.
I mean, no. Hey, y'all, this is a simple answer. Was Jesus a good Christian?
Yes.
No.
He was not any kind of Christian by that strict sense.
Was anyone a good Christian then? No. What was Jesus? He was a good Jew. He followed the law completely, obeyed it well. He was not a Christian because Christianity had not started. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we read about the life and the times of the Lord, the life and times of Jesus. And it takes us up to His death, or His resurrection, really. At the end of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, at the very end, were there Christians?
When they started going out and teaching
Where was that?
with that,
Well, no. Okay, good point. Jesus sent out His disciples, sent out 70 first. Then He sent out the 12. Were they teaching Christians? No. They were preaching the kingdom of heaven is at hand. They were not teaching people about Christianity. There was not Christianity yet.
Christ had died. The testator had died.
The testator had not died yet. So they were still living under that old law. Well, it wasn't old to them. They were still living under the law that was delivered by Moses. There was not an old and a new law. They were living under the law at the time. Okay?
I was going to say, to Craig's point, nothing changed until Christ's death. So
Yes.
everything was still the same. But there were disciples of Christ, so they were
Sure.
followers.
They were followers of Christ.
Looked different than it did after.
Yeah, because instead of following some of the Jewish leaders who were many Pharisaical, saying one thing and doing something different, Jesus was following the law completely and righteously. So He was different, and He was calling His disciples to be different, but not Christians at that time. Okay? Good that we're making some of these distinctions and kind of seeing how this flows. So look, so we keep talking about this old law versus a new law. In the middle of the period of time when the Jews were living under the law that was delivered by Moses, the law that God gave to Moses to give to the people, God had already determined there was going to be an end of this law. So look at Jeremiah chapter 31. So all of these pages here in between, give us the life and the times of the children of Israel. We read about times when they obeyed God and they prospered. We read about times when they disobeyed God and He punished them and called them back. In the days of, just what's going on here in the days of Jeremiah? What do you know? What's happening in the days of Jeremiah? Things that are going great?
Israel's experienced a significant decline in the preceding decades.
So Israel's far away from God. So much so that captivity has taken place. Jeremiah is one of the prophets that God sent to Israel, prophesying mostly in Jerusalem. Significance of Jerusalem? What's the significance of Jerusalem in that time?
Headquarters of the Jews.
I mean, that's kind of the center point of so much that has happened, right? With the children of Israel. The temple was there. Well, at this point, was there. Had been there. It's been destroyed now by the Babylonians. But remember, it's like when during the period of time when the children of Israel were obeying God and there was worship taking place there in Jerusalem at the temple, the Levitical priests were offering the sacrifices there and all of that. God's presence filled the temple, remember, in the days of Solomon? Isn't that just hard to even imagine? God's presence filled the temple. Not now. That's changed now. Because of the people. Not because of God, because of the people. God's presence is not there. In fact, most of the people aren't there, except a remnant that was left in Jerusalem. Chapter 31 of Jeremiah. Here's what God tells Jeremiah to deliver to the people. And I can only imagine, as Jeremiah is saying these things or penning these words, I just imagine Jeremiah does not really have an understanding at all about what he is saying, what these words say. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31. The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. Give me some high points. I mean, what in the world is Jehovah God talking about? I mean, he just gave them this law. Well, just gave them a few hundred years ago. He gave them this law in the most spectacular way, on the tablets of stone. And now he's saying a new law. Why?
Well, the new law is provided to all people.
Okay.
Huge difference.
Okay. Here's one thing. It's not just for the Jews. It's going to be for all. What else? What do we learn from this text? Yeah, forgive sin and remember it no more. What's different about that compared to the old law? Wasn't there atonement under the old law?
Roll it forward, it didn't really truly address it.
Okay. I mean, sacrifices happened how often?
Yearly, some more often than that.
Every day there were sacrifices. There were the everyday sacrifices. There were the feast days that happened every year. There were the Sabbath day sacrifices. There were the sacrifices that you might bring, individual sacrifices. Sacrifice, over and over and over and over and over. I mean, and it's like, we'll see, the blood of bulls and goats could not take away the sins of man. And so here God is saying, He's delivering a new law. I'll forgive their sins and remember them no more. Hey, this is pretty big. This is pretty significant what God is promising.
Saying in Hebrews it talks about the sacrifices being a constant reminder of sin, and so it's almost like and as Paul talks about, shows us just how sinful and how much we fall short, and that's.
When we think about what we learn from the Old Testament, and not to get too far ahead of ourselves, we see in the Old Testament the propensity of man to sin. We see that, and we see the result of trying to have a relationship with God in the constant need of forgiveness through sacrifices being offered over and over and over again. Just one of those lessons learned from the Old Testament. Well, anything else? I mean, from Jeremiah 31, anything else that just kind of stands out? Why was the Old Testament going away? Why?
Mankind failed.
Yeah, man failed. They abused it. They broke the covenant. Because man broke the covenant. Not even just once. He broke it over and over.
Continually.
So, God is saying this is coming to an end. The contrast, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I'll put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. What comes to mind with that? What's different? Write it in their mind and in their hearts. What's different about that?
I think because the way we get the truth is we read His Word. This is how we get the truth, is God's written Word. I think that's the big difference right there, is that we're reading it and we're making it a part of who we are.
Okay.
It's something that we put on our minds and hearts when we read His truth, when we hear
Okay.
His truth.
There's truth in what you're saying. I mean, here, God's Word is of no benefit to us if we don't take it in our heart and live it. Of course, that old law was written down too, and they could read it. But there seemed to be a problem that all did not take it into their heart. That's true today too. But in that time, you could be a Jew. You could still be considered a part of the people of God, but not obey the law. I'm not saying just being a Jew made you have a relationship with God, but you could still be called a Jew, part of that chosen people of God. In this new law, it's for all men, someone has said.
Well, to me, that would have been a huge thing for
Oh.
those people at that time
Right.
to hear this, who would be saying, "We are the chosen people
Right.
of God."
Yeah. Yeah, what are you
And
talking about
he is
here?
now saying, "No, you won't.
Right.
This will be open to anyone who loves me and takes and obeys my will."
This being one of the great distinctions between that old law and the new law. So in the big picture right here, our time's just about done. In this Jeremiah 31 passage, I want us to see so clearly, God said there's going to be a new law. It's going to be different than the old law. That old law was fine, but you broke it. This is going to be written on your heart and mind. It's going to be for all men. When? He just said in that time. Doesn't say when, but we've identified there's a new law coming. Okay, God willing, I want us to take up right here on Wednesday night and try to keep going. In your book, if you read the first 2 or 3 pages, that was a good introduction. Read a couple more, and it's going to take us kind of where we're going. We're not like just going through the book, page by page here. But now you have an idea of where we're going. Thank you for being here this morning.